I think the superpower in marketing is definitely on the open source community, right? So on one hand, it's like how do we continue to engage the community? We have like an open source user conference called the Ray Summit. Last year, we have the CPO of OpenAI came and talked to us about his experience on AI and his view AI to like at least spark some ideas on what we can do. And then you can do very specific, right? Because like there's a character limit, there's certain words that you want to focus. There's the intentions for the app. AI continually evolves and actually do some of these workflow, right? Like I know companies like in SEO as an example, like you can build workflows or agents to kind of like do the keyword research for you to know like what is the biggest gap. And once you have done the keyword research and decide what are the keywords that you want to try to target, then I think foundation model like OpenAI Claude is still the number one tool that we use on AI on a lot of marketing. I still have dabbled in some of the image creation or generation tool. It isn't quite the quality that we wanted yet. And so I think we often use like a framework called Daisy to
Okay.
making sure like you have the skills to kind of get the projects to the finish line.
Mhm.
And I think that is like kind of the common theme, regardless of like the size of the company. Like as in like people are not things are not clear. As an example of like what counts towards pipeline, right? To what point like it is like sales that taking on the deals going forward, right? And so
True.
like as an example, like we use a framework called BANT, like BANT, which is
Welcome back to another episode of the Modern Dev GTM Brew. I'm Tisha, your host, and today's episode is one that you definitely don't want to miss. Our guest today is Rodolfo Yu. Rodolfo has spent years in leading demand gen and GTM for some of the biggest names in AI and cloud infrastructure, including AnyScale, Okta, and Recharge. He has helped scale DevTool adoption, built data driven marketing engines, and knows exactly what it takes to turn top of funnel traction into real business impact. In this episode, we'll unpack what works, what doesn't in DevTool GTM, how to scale in a competitive market, and how AI is reshaping GTM strategies today. Welcome to our podcast, Rodolfo. We are thrilled to have you.
thank you for having me and thank you for the intro.
Great. So, Rodolfo, before we dive into the playbooks and the strategies, let's start with your journey. So, you've worked with some of the biggest cloud and AI infrastructure companies. What first drew you to the DevTool GTM space?
Yeah, I have all throughout my career, I have been in demand gen for the longest time from like Series A company, first marketer, and then throughout different chapters, I've always sold to developers. So like Okta, Recharge, and then now AnyScale. And I just find it fascinating on like the intersection between technology and marketing. And I live in San Francisco, right? So that's kind of like the best place to be in like working in software, selling to developers.
Oh, very interesting. For those who aren't really familiar with any scale, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so AnyScale is a AI platform. We are the commercial solutions for the open source Ray framework, and Ray provide a distributed workload for training, tuning, servings, and many others for machine learning. And so if you think about, we're very similar to like Databricks as an example, where they
Okay.
had like the Apache Spark framework and then
Mm.
Databricks building on top of it. So we are in a very similar vein in terms of like go to market selling to like engineers.
Understood. So AI infrastructure is a very crowded space. How did you position any scale to stand out?
Yeah, I think it's really positioning Ray as our like a core competitive advantage.
Okay.
Ray is open source, so like anyone can use it. We have like 30, almost like 40,000 GitHub stars right now. So we are pretty well known in on very early on like distributed. The founders always joked that on like when they started it, maybe only like Google, Meta had that level amount of data that needs to be distributed.
Mhm,
But right now, like fast forward a few years, like almost like every company needed that, right?
mhm.
And so I think we are lucky or fortunate to have that first mover and open source adoptions there.
Understood. How was AnyScale able to bring so much adoption, in the open source space? And then how has that shaped your GTM strategies?
Yeah, I think the company has invested a lot of energy in early on, especially the first few years of the founding company.
Mhm.
And so like the first few years is like there's no revenue, no sales team. It's purely like a developer building community in terms of marketing. I joined like after that chapter.
Oh, understood. And I think, while scaling DevTool adoption in an open source is in itself a challenge, but one of the biggest challenge begins when you try and monetize an open source community. Did you feel that, AnyScale also felt that challenge, or was it like a smooth sailing?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging, right? I think challenging in different means, right? Like on one hand, developers, especially people who use open source,
Yeah.
doesn't want to be sold to. Like that is exactly why they using open source, right? On the other hand, it's like the challenge for us on trying to make money is like how do we convince and add value, right? So I think that's like psychology of kind of the audience and the targeting. And then I think the second part is like on the product side. Like if you can do everything in open source, like why do I need to buy
Yeah.
commercial? What is the value prop of commercial? How much more value or optimizations we can get, right?
Got it. But how do you still stay true to the community, right? How do you make sure that whatever value open source is giving, it's still a value add and everything is not just enterprise.
Yeah. So the way that I mean, very similar to like any other open source company, right? Like if you think about, hey, you can do a standard set of functionality with open source, but on the
Mhm,
commercial side, like obviously the team that we build the framework have gone through a lot of implementations, the
mhm,
technical challenges for similar use cases, especially in AI, the the tech stack on like the layering on like the infrastructure, the integration with other tools, the compliance, the regulations, etc. And so those are the value add that we can add. And obviously, ultimately, we still want to make sure the commercial solution is more performant in terms of optimization, saving, and time and cost. So those are like the metrics that we drive or the value that we drive for our customers.
interesting. So Rodolfo, once AnyScale decided to commercialize, what was their GTM playbook, and then how did you sort of contribute to that?
I think the superpower in marketing is definitely on the open source community, right?
Mhm.
So on one hand, it's like how do we continue to engage the community, one that they can continue to get value from the community and the open source product. At the same time, how do we talk to them to see where are still their pain point in even using open source, in like where are the ways that we can try to start a commercial relationship on top of the open source relationship. So one way that we do is like annually we have like an open source user conference called the Ray Summit. Last year we have the CPO of OpenAI came and talked to us about his experience on AI and his view. We have a lot of community members who speak at the conference to kind of share their journey with Ray and how they adopt Ray within their company. And like over time, like we see, hey, like even though you are using Ray, there's like certain optimizations that we can still do it on the proprietary level. We can leverage our professional services, and we can also like do multi-cloud as well as like on-prem, depending on what accelerator or cloud you use for that combinations. And so I think it's like really top users that like you have a list of like top users, top companies to like moderate users, right? And then you kind of see like because we ultimately look at like GPU usage, like the high usage that you have, the more custom or complex environments that you probably would have. And so those are the ways that we kind of pick companies and prioritize our resources to start a commercial solution.
So apart from your open source users, was there any other GTM strategies that you employed, and were there any other channels that you sort of employed?
Yeah, so besides events, we obviously have the developer advocates. So I think the developer advocates team continue to like engage and see. I think the way that we think about it is there's two journeys, right? One is like, hey, you have been very successful using open source. Like, how do we build on top of that? Or is there a way like, hey, you are exploring using open source because you already have that need for distributed computing? Can we jump over the hoops to like, hey, let's engage on your commercial? We'll help you to kind of augment open source and like what are the value adds. And and that's how we help a lot of like up and coming digital native companies to kind of like fast to market essentially. We talk about events, we talk about developer advocates. Like we obviously have the a free trial, like a PLG motion, and then we also have like the long tail of digital marketing channels. Like everything about content, website, ads. Those are the channels that we do deploy out to making sure like everyone knows about Ray and AnyScale.
Understood. Quite a comprehensive strategy then, Rodolfo.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned, events and conferences. And I see a lot of DevTool companies using either, their own conferences or, participating in a lot of other conferences. What has been your experience and how important do you feel these offline events and connects are for DevTool GTM?
Yeah. I think community led I think community led like go to market it's like very applicable to like especially early days open source or like dev tools because I think ultimately you need kind of need the face time or convince like how people try your dev tool, especially if your dev tool is like very in a crowded space. And events is always a good way to making sure like people spend time with you. And the way that we look at events is like we have our user conference, we have our own events, we do some of the trade shows, and when we do a lot of like developer events, like meetup in San Francisco, because that's where the community are. And so I think the more time that the founders or the engineering team spend time with the developers, like that's how you kind of grow with the customers or grow with the community that you might have.
Understood. So, you said that, developers are people who would really want to try before sort of buying a product. And that we've seen that, DevTool demand gen is quite different from traditional SaaS. What are some of the biggest differences that you have seen in your journey?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is like think about like the security, right? Where it's very clear like top-down selling, right?
Mhm,
Like the company deploys the HR system or like SSO provider, everyone in the company needs to use it, right?
mhm,
Versus developers, like there's a lot of bottoms-up motions on PLG because they want to try it, they want to test it out. They might try it. Like to me, most difference is compared to traditional is like kind of like the SDR motion.
mhm,
So like top-down SDRs, it's like, hey, the SDR kind of calling and trying to get you meeting.
mhm,
Like I give you like a elevator pitch, like can I get like 10, 15 minutes for it to understand, right? You have like exactly looking for like similar things or like the pain point that you're trying to have. I think
mhm.
on developer, it doesn't work that way, right? Like no one cold calls a developer or like a CTO. That just doesn't really work that way for them. Like it's like, why do you waste my time? I think the way that we think about is like, what are like some of the technical SDRs that we can add value when they try to use our product,
Mhm.
especially in the early days, right? So like in the onboarding steps, did they complete the onboarding step? Did they do the activation step that we wanted them to do? Did they
Mhm.
actually have a question, right? So like a lot of dev tool company that I would talk to is like, hey, let's just like try the SDR to be like the support persons for like the first couple of interactions and making sure like the SDR is technical enough to answer
Mhm.
their questions, right?
Yeah.
Or like at least have way to like solve their problem first. And
Mhm.
then once they pass the activation, like they need to see the magic moment, right? Like which is like the aha moment on like the activation.
Yeah.
And I think that from now on, then you can continue to like, hey, like I see you are using X, Y, and Z. Like it seems like you have a real use case here. Like,
Mhm.
is there someone to like connect with you with an SE or like an AE, right? That's like kind of the mindset that I would coach or like guide the team on. And signups are easy, like sometimes in developer tools because everyone just want to try.
Yeah.
Activations oftentimes is like the harder piece.
Mhm.
And so regardless of what the activation metrics, like that should be like some of the alignment there. But I think that's kind of like a gray area, right? Because it's not as clear as just like for like top-down SDR, like just sourcing a meeting and then
Mhm.
pass it on to the AE to sell, right? Like that's kind of like technical nuance gray area that I would highlight.
Oh, interesting. So what I'm understanding is that, for an SDR selling a dev tool, getting the timing right, getting the messaging right, and actually reaching out to the right person is very important.
Yeah, it's probably not much of a selling motion because you just try and make sure like they are successful and they
Mhm.
trust your product and finish free trial and like they put in their credit card at the end of it, right?
Mhm.
So like, are you considering other tools just to better understanding your use cases? But like you sell all the way to the CTO, then you probably need like, hey, I see you have multiple users signing up for this. Can we
Yeah.
create a team account for your team so that you have better visibility with finance in terms of security, cross team like selling can happen. And so like it relates to like my earlier point on like, hey, like where are you in the spectrum, right? In terms of selling, like because there are ways that you can sell it basically wall to wall within the engineering team, or
Mhm.
like, hey, you're just trying to get as many credit cards as you are on covering the number of logos that you want to do, right? And so that would be like a maturity journey that I see.
Understood. Thanks for that deep dive, Rodolfo. So, wanted to understand you've worked, at demand gen with for different companies, right, from Okta to AnyScale. How have you seen demand gen evolve? From your time when you were at Okta to now at AnyScale, how are things different?
Yeah, I think marketing always evolve with technology, right?
Mhm.
When I started it, like, hey, yes, like ads are just ads. Like there's no B2B ads at that
Mhm.
point when
Yeah.
I just started.
Yeah.
And so like the first way kind of like it I had to well the way that I frame it is like throughout the technology, there's like getting more B2B focus, getting the targeting more right, but the fundamentals of marketing doesn't change, right? And the technology evolves, like now it's about AI. I think marketing, there are more creative ways to drive that efficiency and to be in front of our buyers, right? Versus sales, like sales doesn't have that much. Like the only resource constraint for them is like time,
Yeah.
right? Because how many times I can get in front of our customers and calls, but just want to make sure like for anyone who's working in marketing, just to kind of follow along be curious about the technologies that can be applied into the day to day, as well as like how can you change about your programs or motions or tactics that you might have.
So what are some of the things that you were doing at Okta which evolved at your time at AnyScale, or what were some of the initiatives at AnyScale which weren't existent when you were at Okta?
Yeah, so one thing it's like as obvious is like we don't have AI to write
Yeah.
content, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think everyone is using AI to write content in different ways. In
Mm-hmm.
Okta, it's a very manual process. Like we have like a queue for like content creation essentially. And the same for ads. Like we kind of try to use like um AI to like at least spark some ideas on what we can do. And then like you can do very specific, right? Because like there's a character limit, there's certain words that you want to focus, like
Yes.
there's the intentions for the ad. And so like all these things you can basically prompt the AI to kind of give you ideas and you kind of have to pick the ideas. Otherwise, like you other persons or your team is kind of the one that generate many different options, right? So
Yeah.
like as simple as that can just like spark or help you to do your job better. Um, and no way that AI can replace the creativity process, but at least it gives you the options to decide, right?
Yeah. Understood. So what I'm hearing is that while the basic principles of marketing remain same, AI also significantly changed how you approach things at any scale while your stint at Okta.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how AI continually evolves and actually do some of this workflow, right? Like I know companies like in SEO as an example, like you can build workflows or agents to kind of like do the keyword research for you to know like what is the biggest gap. And once you have done the keyword research and decide what are the keywords that you want to try to target, then you
Mhm.
kind of create the content or like what is the framework or outline for and then you kind of continue to build different workflow for
Good.
like your SEO content creation essentially, right?
Good.
Same with like outreaches or nurtures, right? Like you can book meetings directly or you can do follow up. Like that's kind of like how a lot of like AI SDLs, like the promise of the AI SDLs.
Understood. So what are some of the tools that, if you had to recommend to someone which you use, what are some of those AI tools?
Yeah, I think foundation model like OpenAI Claude is still the number one tool that we use on AI on a lot of marketing. I still have dabbled in some of the image creation or generation tool.
Okay.
Isn't quite the quality that we wanted yet, and so I think because no one actually asked for inputs yet. Input is like, hey, your previous content or your website, the style guide, CSS, they ingest that. Then I can see the image can be a lot more high quality. But LLMs today are still like the number one tools. And then the second one that I would say is probably Clay, like just kind of connecting all the pieces together as a connector. Like we put OpenAI into Clay so that they can generate some prompts so that we can get more personalized. So those are the two tools that I would say like that are, it's definitely it's going to be on top.
Understood. With AI evolving, do you also see a shift in how developers are actually discovering dev tools, and is that also shifting?
I think yes, like everyone is using Cursor, they're using multiple tools. But I think the discovery doesn't change that much, right? Like if you think about like what people do every day, like they browse on social, they talk to their friends, they talk to their coworkers. So like most of the places they hang out is like, which is like a lot of social medias and text messages and Reddit, and then Slack, which is like the primary like source of work interactions and collaborations. And like that's like how they know about like new tools, right? And then the last thing is like events, right? I talk about you live in San Francisco, you go to events or you see billboards. So from a discovery, doesn't change that much.
Understood. Understood. So exciting things, and very excited to see how AI is sort of evolving, and then, what else it can do in the demand gen space. How do you see, AI changing the demand gen space? Like, is there any other AI tool that you wish existed but does not exist right now?
I think the biggest shift in terms of marketers will probably be less about hands-on execution,
Okay.
more about strategic thinking and thinking. And I think the people that you're trying to reach and the ways that you can reach them doesn't change that much. And I think that's like sometimes like that's kind of like when I interview candidates, like that's what I'm trying to nail down because like taste is a lot harder to articulate.
Yeah.
Versus hey, as long as you understand the principle, then you can do your jobs.
Understood. So you mentioned that, when you hire, these are some of the characteristics that you try and sort of assess. So you've built, teams across different types of companies, right, from startups to enterprises. Um, what do you look when you are hiring, and what are some of the key ingredients to getting the demand gen right at different stages?
Yeah, I think drive is probably more important. It's probably the other thing that I would look for.
Sure.
In early stage, like companies, like that's how like you think about hassle, right? Like you work very quickly, like you get things done. And then when I say drive in bigger company, it's like can you cut through the noise to drive the project forward through cross-functional collaborations, right? And very clear on like your responsibility. Like we often use like a framework called Daisy to
Okay.
making sure like you have the skills to kind of get the projects to the finish line. And I think that is like kind of the common theme, regardless of like the size of the company.
Understood. What is this framework that you spoke about? Could you sort of elaborate a bit on that?
It's called Daisy. So like it's driver, approver, inform. And so it's basically who is driving the project, who's ultimately approving the
Okay.
project from like the people who will contribute to the project, and then who's like informed, as in like people need to know, like kind of keep updated on like where the project is. So
Understood.
that's kind of a very common Daisy framework to make sure like the projects have clarity.
Understood. Understood. So while we discussed, how is hiring different at different stages of a company, do you also feel that demand gen strategies are equally different, if you're in a startup or if you're in a, say, $100 million ARR company?
Yes, it definitely different.
Okay.
But I think the principle doesn't change,
Mhm.
right? The principle that we talk about, like the problem solution, the audience kind of like generically think about efficiency. What change is kind of like the sizing of
Mhm.
the investments of different channels as well as like the people, right? And the sizing also changed and those two kind of the third leg is like the systems. Um, and so like the system in a $10 million business versus like 100 million or like $1 billion, like it's very different, right? And how to succeed or improve the systems takes like experience, whether you have seen Greg before, takes agility on like adaptability, and it takes drive, right, to like building and improving like the system.
Understood. Understood. What do you feel that, in this evolving landscape, which is one marketing channel or playbook which is completely dead, specifically for DevTools?
I would say content syndication. So for those who don't know, content syndication is basically you try to produce a piece of content, you
Mhm.
publish in third-party sites, and then they distribute it. I personally don't have great success with it. Maybe I just haven't tried it a lot in DevTools. I've seen success more so in like security space from a net new names perspective. But to me, developers, especially if you have a bottoms up perspective, like
Mhm.
written content, it's like really hard to get their attentions, not the product, right?
Mhm.
And so that's kind of my personal bias.
Okay. So what do you think has sort of replaced that? If not written content, are we saying that it's the form of content, or are we saying it's particular content that doesn't work?
I think it's like content syndication is just because like the content is just distributed through third parties and then they
Okay.
get the email addresses. Like that would be not my priority in terms of in a dev tool company.
Mhm. So if you had to replace, one channel, what do you feel is the most successful one right now?
Focus on community, focus on the product. Like
Mhm.
that will always true. Like I think you do need to find where you excel at, find your niche and that you really win and then continue to grow your company by like tackling adjacent space. Because otherwise you will be like covering too broad.
Understood. Um, Thanks for sharing that, Rodolfo. DevTools specifically, the sales cycles can be very tricky. So how do you see, sales and marketing collaborating to tackle that together?
Um, I think when you say tricky, it's probably a lot of that may contribute to like the lack of definitions.
Mm-hmm.
Like as in like people are not things are not clear. As an example of like what counts towards pipeline,
Okay.
right? Like
Yeah.
where to what point like it is like sales that taking on the deals going forward, right? And so
Mhm.
like as an example, like we use a framework called BANT, like BANT, which is budget, authority, need, and timeline. Like as long as you check out like 2 out of 4, then you should be able to carry the sales cycle forward.
Understood. So what I'm hearing is, a lot of clarity and a lot of transparency, so that everyone is aligned on what a particular term means, what a pipeline looks like, and then a reason as to why you should have a meeting with a particular, prospect if required.
Yeah.
Understood. So Rodolfo, you've sort of worked across multiple companies, and you've seen demand gen sort of from different lenses in those companies. If you had to steal one growth playbook from another dev tool, whose would it be?
I think Vercel is great.
Okay. Which
Vercel one playbook, which would be for the I would say branding.
one?
Um, I think branding is one of those things that taste determines a
Mm-hmm.
big factor in it, and I think they have evolved their branding over time. And everything is like leaning very heavily on their branding. And so I think that is one playbook.
Interesting. And if you had to give like one piece of advice to someone who's trying to scale demand gen right now, what would that be?
Know your user is
Mm-hmm.
probably my number one advice. Is like what is kind of like the common journey that they go through. When do they look for your solutions or your tool, right? Uh, and try to understand their mindsets and how they get to discover your tool. The more insights you have, either you talk to the users directly, you talk to the sales team directly, you meet people directly, the more intuitions or experience you will get to like understand the personas that you sell to.
Understood. Thanks for that cool piece of advice, Rodolfo. So I think this has been a very insightful conversation. Thank you for sharing this with us. But before we wrap up, let's do a quick rapid fire round. Does that work?
Yeah, that's great. Let's do it.
So, what's one dev tool that you can't live without?
ChatGPT.
What's the best piece of marketing advice you have ever received?
Integrity is key.
What's the last thing that you Googled?
Funding rounds of a company.
What's one demand gen metric that's very overrated?
MQL.
What's a common marketing best practice that actually doesn't work?
That's a tricky one. Over optimizing on that.
If you could go back 5 years, what's one career move you do differently?
I would spend more time looking for the right company.
Okay. And if you could take a 6-month break to learn any new skill, what would that be?
Vibe coding.
All right, the last question now. What's one piece of startup advice people should actually ignore?
I would ignore more advice than you would think.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that, well, when I say that is because the other way to frame that question is like, just trust your instinct.
Okay.
Because a lot of people will give you a lot of opinions, but you know your business better, you know your role better, like trust your instinct on what is right.
Interesting. Cool piece of advice again, Rodolfo. Thank you for your time. I think this has been incredible. And we can't wait to see, what you tackle next.
Thank you so much for having me, and it has been a fun conversation.
Thank you, Rodolfo.
Thank you.